If I could have everyone's attention, I believe we do have a quorum. Good morning, members of the MAG Transportation Policy Committee. This meeting is now called to order. We have two new Transportation Policy Committee members. I would like to welcome Councilmember Kathy Littlefield, City of Scottsdale, and City of Scottsdale Vice Mayor Vincent Manfredi. Start over. Welcome Councilmember Kathy Littlefield, City of Scottsdale, and Vice Mayor Vincent Manfredi, City of Maricopa. We look forward to your participation on this committee. For those around the table, please turn on your microphone when speaking so those on the phone can hear you. For those participating on Zoom, please remember to unmute your device before speaking and mute when you are not speaking to create a positive experience for all of the attendees. Phone participants should use *6 to mute, unmute, and *9 to raise your hand. The MAG public comment process provides opportunities for members of the public to comment on items scheduled on today's agenda or on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction. There are three opportunities provided for public comment, including call to the audience, the consent agenda, and action items to be heard. MAG also provides the opportunities for members of the public to submit written comments via MAG website prior to the meeting, as long as the comments are received at least 1 hour prior to the posted start time for the meeting. If you would like to comment at today's meeting, please fill out a white request to speak card that are located on the information table in the hallway. Please be sure to indicate the agenda item for which you want to speak and give it to a designated MAG staff member. If you parked in the garage, remember to validate your ticket. Parking validators are available on the information table in the hallway. For those of you who purchased a transit ticket to come to the meeting, please see staff for a ticket. Please note that hearing assisted devices are available from MAG staff. We will now begin the meeting with a roll call of all members. Linda, will you call the roll?
Thank you, Chair. When I call your name, please indicate you are present for the record. Rock Arnett.
Present.
Thank you. Dave Barry. Thank you. Doug DeCluson.
Present.
Thank you. Kate, Mayor Gallego. Mayor Giles.
Present.
Thank you. Mayor Hall. Mayor Harkey.
Here.
Thank you. Charles Humantle.
Here.
Thank you. Councilmember Littlefield.
Here.
Thank you. Cheryl Lombard. Vice Mayor Manfredi. Jackie Meck. Mayor Orsborn. Mayor Peterson. Here. Thank you. Mark Reardon.
Here.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaefer.
Present.
Thank you. Councilmember Stipp.
Present.
Thank you. Mayor Weyers. Thank you. Mayor Weiss. Councilmember Wheatley. Mayor Woods.
Here.
Thank you. Is there anyone I have missed? Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Would you now please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next is our call to the audience. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction that are not on the agenda or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. 15 minutes will be provided for the call to the audience agenda item unless the committee requests an exception to this limit. Members of the public who are attending in person may deliver their comments from the lectern at the front of the room, and you'll have up to 3 minutes to complete your comments. A timer is provided to assist you. When the light on the timer changes from green to yellow, you have 1 minute remaining. If the light turns red, a buzzer will sound, meaning your allotted time has expired. Have we received any request to speak cards on this agenda?
Chair, no public comments have been received for this item or any other item on the agenda.
Thank you. Are there any members of the public here today who desire to speak on this item? Staff, do we have any written comments for this item?
We do not.
If we receive any additional written comments prior to the meeting, I will let you know. On to the consent agenda. Our next item is consent agenda items 4A through 4F. Does any member of the committee have questions or request a presentation on any of the consent items?
Second.
We have a motion from Mayor Wise, a second from Charles Humantle. Any discussion? Any opposed? Motion passes.
Mr. Chair, I think we need to do a roll call.
Okay,
Virtual,
I forgot.
sorry.
Linda,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you, Chair. When I call your name, please indicate how you vote. Rock Arnett.
Yes.
Thank you. Dave Barry.
Yes.
Thank you. Doug DeCluson.
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Giles.
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Hall. Mayor Harkey.
Yes.
Thank you. Charles Humantle.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Littlefield.
Yes.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Manfredi. Bridget Peterson.
Yes.
Thank you. Mark Reardon.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaefer.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Stipp.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Wires.
I vote aye.
Thank you. Councilmember Wheatley.
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Woods.
Yes.
Thank you. And Chair, how do you vote?
Aye.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously.
Just for the record, Chair, Mayor Osborne, I made it in late, sorry. So I'm here and I vote aye. Thank you.
Okay. Next, we'll move to agenda item 5. Regional support for the US 60 Grand Avenue, 35th Avenue, Indian School Road Railway Crossing Elimination Grant Application. Item 5 on the agenda would be presented by Quinn Kiwi Castro, MAG Transportation Engineer. This item is on the agenda for action only.
For discussion only, Chair.
Okay. Thank
Thank you. Next slide, please. So good morning. Thank you for being here today. On July 6, 2022, the US DOT Federal Railway Administration issued a notice of funding opportunity for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program for federal fiscal year 2022. This is made available by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, and a total of $573,264,000 in funding is available to improve American rail infrastructure, to enhance rail safety, improve the health and safety of communities, eliminate highway, rail, and pathway rail grade crossings, and reduce the impacts of freight movement and railroad operations that they may have on underserved communities. This project is currently funded as part of the Prop 400 Freeway Lifecycle Program. Next slide, please. So once again, this funding opportunity is made available for IIJA And as a reminder, earlier this year, Patrick Stone, who manages MAG's TIP, presented earlier on the IIJA, emphasizing the significant investment towards competitive grant-based funding and opportunities not only for existing grant programs, but the addition of new programs. So there's approximately 185 million in the FLCP to fund all phases of pre-design, right-of-way, utility, final design, and construction. Next slide. So this graphic shows the existing interchange configuration. It's a 6-legged intersection with an overpass for the through movements on Indian School Road. There are 2 at-grade crossings of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad and 2 bus routes through this area. Next slide, please. So the Federal Railway Administration tracks safety data at the nation's more than 200,000 railroad crossings. In 2016, they released a list of the railroad crossings in the US where multiple incidents have occurred. There were 15 crossings where 10 or more incidents had occurred in the previous decade. And this intersection had a total of 21 incidents. In the 5 years since, there have been an additional 5 incidents. So this is a short video showing the operations. You can see the 2 railway crossings as well as all the other traffic movements through the interchange. Next slide, please. So these are the proposed improvements. Of note here is new connector roads in various locations that will restore access and facilitate the redistribution of traffic movements. And in particular, the new bridge structure over Indian School Road, for Indian School Road to pass over BNSF and Grand Avenue, and a new bridge structure on 35th Avenue to pass over BNSF and Grand Avenue as well. Next slide. So this here is a rendering of the completed proposed interchange. Once again, there is approximately 185 million in the current freeway life cycle program funded by Prop 400. And the traffic interchange would be entirely reconstructed. So it would elevate the 4 legs of 35th Avenue and Indian Road and grade separate these from both Grand Avenue and the railroad. This would improve traffic flow along US 60 and remove conflict points with the railroad and facilitate future bus rapid transit. So next slide, please. So MAG has taken the lead on the development and submission of this grant proposal, but we have strong support and partnership from ADOT, BNSF, and City of Phoenix. The grant proposals are due October 4th of this year. Project cost estimates are underway to determine the exact ask, but we anticipate it between $75 and $100 million. Any funding received from this grant would reduce the amount of regional funding needed to implement the project. Next slide, please. So again, the action requested today is the recommended approval of support for the US 60 35th Avenue Indian School Road Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Proposal. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Any questions from the committee for Ms. Castro? Hearing none, is there a motion to recommend approval of support for the US 60 Grand Avenue, 35th Avenue, Indian School Road Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Application?
So moved.
Second. We have a motion from Charles Humantle, a second from Mayor Harkey. Any discussion? Can I have a voice vote from those in the room? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Linda will now do a roll call vote for all members participating.
Thank you, Chair. When I call your name, please indicate how you vote. Mayor Giles.
Yes.
You, Mayor Hall.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Litchfield.
Yes.
Thank you. I believe I saw Mayor Mack. Mayor Mack.
Yes.
Thank you. Mark Reardon.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaefer,
Aye for agenda item number 5, Railroad Crossing Elimination Program.
thank you. Councilmember Wheatley,
Yes.
thank you. And Mayor Woods,
Yes.
thank you. And Chair, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item 6, air quality and the implications of transportation and economic development will be presented by Tim Franquist, MAG Environmental Director. This item is on the agenda for information and discussion. Tim?
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for having me today. I think maybe our weather is actually conducive to this. Maybe a larger thunderstorm would probably be helpful, but I think we're going to be talking about kind of 2 major storms that are brewing at the same time. One's kind of a newer storm, one you guys have been talking about a lot for good reason, and that's the Prop 400E issues. And that you guys know all too well what that means to our community, what that means to our society, what that means to our economy. The other storm that we're going to be talking about is one that's been brewing for quite some time, and that's the ozone non-attainment in the area. That started about 2016, where we started seeing a change in the standard. Those clouds started to loom on the horizon, and over time, this has brewed into a significant storm. So I kind of want to set that motif for you as we go through this. Both the Prop 400E issue and this ozone non-attainment issue are now combining into a significant issue in the valley. And I'll go through some pretty in-depth slides, so I apologize up front. Always happy to talk with people afterward, but we're going to kind of do some dives into some ozone offsets, some air quality permitting. Not the most fun topic at a lunchtime. So again, I'm always happy to talk with people offline after that. Next slide, please. So just in terms of a recap for folks that may not know, MAG is delegated. It's a very unique thing for several air pollutants. So we do the planning for ozone, for carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. As you can see here, we're a big city. With big city comes many, many different challenges. Air quality challenges is certainly part of that. Next slide, please. What you can see here are the standards. These do change over time, and I'll get into a little bit later. But again, as I mentioned, these are the 4 pollutants that we are designated at MAG to do the planning for. Again, very unique thing. The only other area that I've seen in the nation that does this is Washington, D.C. So I think we're very proud to have this opportunity here. It is a huge challenge, but with huge challenges come with huge opportunities. So next slide, please. Alrighty. So kind of getting into what we're really going to be talking about today, which is ozone. Ozone, you've probably seen in the newspapers, probably day doesn't go by. Certainly in the summer, we haven't seen a high pollution advisory. There's 2 standards that we compete with. One just got superseded. So there's the 2008 standard that you can see at the bottom here. That's a 75 parts per billion standard. And you can see the top one there is a 70 parts per billion standard. That's a 2015 standard. And that's the one we're going to be talking about today. That's the map that you can see up here. Something I think it's important to point out, EPA has the opportunity to take a look at these standards every 5 years. They don't change it every 5 years, but they do change it. And you can see the trend is obviously to go lower. Unfortunately, when that happens, we are a growing area, and the non-attainment area actually increases. So we can see here is about an 8% increase in the non-attainment area for what it was in 2008. And we'll talk a bit about what programs come with that. Next slide, please. So here's what we're looking at in terms of measured concentration. So the way the Clean Air Act works, you go up in stringency in terms of your classification when you don't meet a federal standard. So we are currently moderate. That just occurred last Friday. So for the 2015 standard, the EPA minister just signed a notice to bump the region up one more stringent classification into what's called moderate. When you look at the concentrations that we're measuring over time, you can see this kind of range here, 75 to 80. And what that means is 80 is what we're measuring just in the air that we breathe. The 75 represents wildfires excluded. So under the Clean Air Act, when we have a natural event that we can't control, which certainly wildfires, we can actually exclude that data for the purposes of planning. That has a significant impact, as you can see, somewhere between 5 and 6 parts per billion. The piece that I like to point out here, though, is we're still breathing this air. So this 80 parts per billion that we're measuring is the air that we experience when we go outside. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of that? Significant now. As we move into moderate for this standard, new controls are going to absolutely be required. That's not something that's happened in the area. And so I think that's something I want to come and talk to you about. Again, we'll talk a little bit about the convergence of the Prop 400E issues. The transportation definitely plays into that. But new control measures in our area are going to be essential for us to move the needle on this. Unfortunately, we just can't get there from here. In fact, I was talking with a staff member before I came down. We may need to even look and talk to the state about changing statutes to get there. Because again, the things we are not able to do under the current statute, which is be more stringent than the federal government, simply won't get us there from here. The other things that we'll be looking at is emission offsets, and we'll talk a little bit about that. That has a significant impact on existing businesses and new businesses that want to move in the area. Contingency measures, if we have to implement those, if we don't meet the standards at different milestone intervals. And then something that's new with this 2015 standard is looking outside the non-attainment area. This is kind of a tricky one because as we talk to the state and the feds, is what does that look like? That looks like potentially having to talk to the state about implementing additional controls on what already heavily regulated industry. A lot of those industries outside of area are subject to pretty stringent permits today. And so again, this is not a place that we want to go to, but we are actually, our backs are to the wall on this one. So we may have to start having conversations in this area that we simply haven't had before. Next slide, please. Next slide. We'll get a little bit into the trends. So let me start with kind of what ozone is. So ozone is considered a secondary pollutant. So it's not something that comes from a stack or a tailpipe. It's made up of what's called precursors. The first precursor is volatile organic compounds. Nature actually produces those, so trees and plants. Wildfires that you spoke about will actually produce those. Solvents, microchip manufacturers, industry can produce those. So we have a variety of sources there. We come to oxides and nitrogen. This is usually kind of a fossil fuel combustion source. So vehicles, utilities are usually the primary source there. When we react that in the presence of sunlight, which we know in Arizona, we have 330 days of sunlight. We have plenty of sunlight here. We are a prime ozone area for that reason. These chemicals have to react within sunlight. As we know over time, this has been a growing issue in the area, as big as today as it was in the past. Next slide, please. So here's what our ozone concentrations look over time. So again, you can see the standard changes. So 97, 2008, 2015, they are getting more stringent over time. And this is a story we've been telling is your air quality isn't necessarily getting worse. A little bit uptick there in the end. We'll have to talk about what's going on now, but typically our air quality is actually improving over time, but the standards are getting more stringent. Again, what you can see at the tail end here, the blue, again, this is the air we're breathing. You can see that the downward trend is actually going back up. Wildfires play big into this. We've seen the California wildfires over the years. They do have a significant impact. Our own wildfires have a significant impact. And what you can see on the red line here is those wildfire data removed. And again, that has a relatively significant impact. When we look at the numbers now, we think we're landing somewhere around that 75 parts per billion. So right on that 2008 standard line. If you kind of look at it that from perspective, we're kind of starting to plateau as an area. And that's kind of a concern. We'll take a look at the next slide. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, the major concern. So wildfires obviously play into this issue. But we're looking at here is all the air monitors in Arizona. The top three are associated with our region. These are kind of the urban monitors, Pinal, Maricopa, and a monitor very close to the city in Hilo County. The bottom graph is what you can see is all the others. So if it was just wildfires alone, you'd expect these all be upticking about the same since most of those wildfires are area wide. So something else other than just wildfires is going on in the area to start to push that blue line up a bit. Next slide, please. On a national trend, again, trying to figure out, how far out are we different? Is this a national issue? Is this a state issue? Again, what you can see is these top urban lines, the dark lines, represent, again, Pinal and Maricopa County. They're starting to uptick, flatten off a little bit. The national trend on ozone is actually going down. So again, I think this is what concerns us most. Is on a state trend, this does seem to be a regional issue. We would expect actually over time this to be trending downward, similar to what we see in the nation. But we're not actually seeing that. So again, this is something we're having to dig into. And this is, again, why we're going to be talking about additional control measures over the next year. Next slide, please. So where does ozone come from? One of the big areas is it actually comes from outside of our area. So we can see with this big darker blue line, this boundary conditions, they call it, this could be some natural background. A lot of this is actually international transport. So that unfortunately, what we have to contend with. What you can see here in lighter blues are from on-road and non-road. I think the key piece here, and this is again where I think the intersection of Prop 400 and the concerns that I started to have as an air director, or excuse me, an environmental director with an air slant, and looking at Prop 400 and transportation mitigation and the air quality benefits we get there. As you can see, that blue and orange related to transportation, only the EPA and California can regulate cars. So when we start talking about what can we do locally to reduce emissions from vehicles, it looks a lot like reducing vehicle miles traveled. It looks a lot like reducing single occupancy vehicle. It looks a lot like congestion mitigation projects. Again, things that are all be funded by Prop 400. So again, this is when my ears started to go up on the air quality side. Is, oh boy, we're kind of going the wrong direction with air quality. This is a huge concern for us. We need every molecule of ozone being reduced. With the Prop 400 potentials, we actually see increases ozone, and we've done some modeling on that to see that it would actually increase based on some of our local controls here. One of the other things I think I would point out is, again, in 1970, when the Clean Air Act was first established, stationary sources, our traditional facilities with a stack up in the air, were the primary sources. Clean Air Act over the last 50 years done a fantastic job. We've reduced emissions drastically. As you can see, you can almost not see what we would call point source there. Yet that myth is still out there. That big factories, facilities are the primary source, and they're certainly not. The transportation industry over time has gotten drastically cleaner. Again, I don't think that story's been told enough. A lot has been weighed on the transportation industry over time, and more is over time. And I think folks in that industry will know EPA right now has targeted transportation in a big way. We've seen that with new NOx emissions. We've seen that with the Federal Highway Administration's new GHG performance measures. A lot is being put on the transportation sector to take care of air quality problems. And I don't know if that's always fair or certainly the best way to do that. Next slide, please. So what does all that mean? Well, the Clean Air Act is very, very directive on how we have to take care of these things. So as we talked earlier, it's kind of a tiered approach, marginal being kind of the lightest, least stringent area, moderate, serious, severe. Only California can hit extreme. So luckily we don't have to go there, but severe looks a lot like California. Again, we're right now on moderate, which brings several different programs. We already have a VEI program here, the Vehicle Emission Testing Program. So that's already in existence. But what you'll see here is RACM, the word RACM and RACT. Those are reasonable available control measures and reasonable available control technologies. The RACT piece is very directive. EPA has a list of what these facilities are. And if you're on that list, you have to implement it. And that's something right now the Maricopa County Air Quality Department is putting together. RACM is what we do here at MAG. That's reasonable available control measures. What that's meant to do is advance attainment. And again, we have something in the neighborhood of 93 control measures on the books today. They're doing a fantastic job of keeping our ozone levels to where they're at. But again, with this new stricter standard, they're simply not going to get us above the hurdle. And again, we'll talk a little bit about emission offsets in a moment here. Next slide, please. Next slide. One more slide. Okay, so we do have a planning option, what's called the but-for emissions. As you saw on the pie chart, we do get emissions from outside this area. It's something in the neighborhood of anywhere from 2 parts per billion from what the EPA's modeled. We've modeled as high as 7. The state's modeled as high as 4 parts per billion coming from outside of our international borders. We can do a but-for demonstration. What I can tell you is when I came on the job a few months ago, EPA was very quick to send us 2 disapprovals of these but-for analysis. And he got in his packet about this big that basically said, don't do this, you can't go there. If your human caused emissions are over your international emissions, they will not approve one of these packages. Again, I disagree with that. I don't think that's what the Clean Air Act says. I don't think that's what the intent was. But again, it's a very different EPA today. So I put that out there. This is an option. But the hurdle to get over this is extremely high, and the EPA has made that very, very clear. Next slide, please. And you can go through about 4. I think it's just some animations here. So let me give you kind of the timeline. The timeline is that our backs are against the wall here. So in 2021 was our attainment date, so last summer for marginal. we would have had to meet the 2015 70 parts per billion standard. That did not happen. For whatever reason, it took the EPA a year to redesignate us to moderate. Again, that just happened with an announcement last Friday. And here's where I think we really need to start having the conversation, banging that drum, hearing the sound of thunder. We have 2 years to implement controls that reduce pollution to the point where we meet the standard. What we can see here is a significant permitting threshold to kick in at that, what they refer to as serious non-attainment. We have 3 more years at that point. If we don't meet the standard at that point, we are literally looking at California level emission controls here in the Phoenix area. So I can't stress that enough. California is so far down the tubes, kind of set the bar for what this looks like. So I think the real catchphrase here is that we need to avoid moderate non-attainment at all costs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So let me get into what this actually means to industry. So I'll give a kind of a high level rundown through here. So I apologize. Clean Air Act 101 right over lunch is never a good thing, but we'll try to go through this. So in a non-attainment area, if you have a new large source, and today that large source would be 100 tons per year. That's a big source. That's a utility size source. That's a new Intel size source. We're talking pretty substantial sources. Or if you do a major modification to an existing source, you modify your source over a certain. Again, that looks a lot like Intel's recent $20 billion expansion. You trigger something that's called an emission offset. So before you can move in the area and operate, or before you make your expansion, you have to get these emission offsets. And those emission offsets are 1.1 to 1, they go up to 1.15, 1.12. So you always have to do what you're emitting plus some more. There's a huge challenge with that. And again, we'll get into that in just a minute. But let me kind of run through this. So we have 2 places we can get those. The Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has what they call an emissions bank. So if a company goes out of business or they do some kind of an emissions modification, they can actually bank those there, advertise them and sell them to new companies, or you can keep them. A lot of companies choose to keep them in case they do some kind of modification. So we call those kind of private credits. We don't know where those are. They're not advertised. Sometimes businesses get in those discussions, business to business. But a lot of times we try to encourage them, get them into the bank so we can encourage economic development in the area. You have to do all that, get your permit before you can actually operate in this area. So we have to go through this whole process, which is multi-year process. So if somebody wants to get to business today, it's going to be a challenge because they're going to have to go through the whole permitting process, find these offsets before they can even begin to break ground and actually build their facilities. Next slide, please. So what are those thresholds look like? So in the today, again, we're at moderate. We're still at the 100-ton threshold. Again, that can be a challenge for the very large businesses we want to encourage into the area. 40 tons per year is the major modification threshold. Again, these are pretty large facilities, so this is probably why we haven't seen major issues, with the exception of the Intel expansion. We'll get into that a little bit. So these are very large facilities. But again, these are the types of facilities we do want to encourage in the area. These are usually very large employers. When we start to hit that threshold of serious, you can see that next line, that red line there. Things change drastically. Major source threshold goes to 50, and the major modification goes to 25. Now we're talking about a run-of-the-mill, normal size company. You want to do an expansion to your existing business. 25 tons is now a more moderate, normal change. Whereas before we were talking about substantial changes. Now we're actually talking about things that are going to really begin to impact new business and existing business. And here too, I want to point out the NSR offsets, what's called the new source review. That's the air quality permitting piece. You can see those go increase over time. So again, if you're a 100 tons producer today, you'd have to offset your emissions by 115 tons. And if you go up from there, then obviously you have to do the ratioing. Next slide, please. So let me give some real world examples of this. So if we were an Intel, which this very much happened in 2021, if everybody remembers that, $20 billion expansion, very exciting for the area. I was the air quality director at the state when this happened, and I remember everybody freezing, pausing, and freaking out. Because of this, we did not know where Intel was going to get these offsets. What you can see is these are offset numbers that the Maricopa County Air Quality Department gave me. These are the VOC NOx from just the expansion alone. And here's the amount that Intel had to produce. At that time, there were 0 offsets available. So what I really want to point out here is this note. It took ADQ, Maricopa County, EPA, and let me mark this, the White House to get involved. EPA does not like going through these offsets. They don't like going outside their traditional boundaries on this. Because that was such a national security and such a big expansion, it actually required the White House to get involved to push Region 9 EPA to work with Intel to get these offsets. I think most folks in my industry would say that may not be replicatable again, just because of the way they did that. So I think that gives us all pause for, okay, how do we get there from here? When we're dealing with a $20 billion expansion, it requires the White House. What if we're not dealing with such a large expansion?
A quick question, Tim. So where does TSMC fall into this?
Chairman, great question. I'm going to actually hit that right now. So
Okay.
next slide, please. So again, to hit the very real world example. So TCM is a 90 tons per year facility. They certainly did this on purpose to get below that 100 ton threshold. And again, that's a good thing. We want to see people reduce their emissions. The Clean Air Act is kind of set up stringently like that. So you go through innovative ways to try not to be a major source and give it to TCM. They are a 90 ton source today. Data centers. This is something I've been talking with my colleague over at Maricopa County Air Quality, Phil McNeely. He says we permit a lot of data centers. It's a really good thing for the area. They typically hang just over the 50 ton per year mark. What happens if we go serious non-attainment is a very high likelihood these facilities don't get built in our region. Again, it's a scarcity of offsets. TCM was able to get under that 100 ton threshold today. If this would happen in a couple of years and we don't make our attainment deadline in 2024, that this is very questionable whether this happens. Same with the data centers. So again, next slide, please. And just in a more hypothetical, again, what we're looking at is a major modification, 25 tons, not huge, not small, but not huge. Company A, if you will, they go through this offsets. They got to come up with 36 tons of very, very scarce to no offsets. And again, this becomes a very significant impact on economic development in the area. Next slide, please. And here's why this becomes a very real world situation. So today, when I ran this on September 12th, what's showing in ADQ's emission bank is 319 tons of VOCs and 97 tons of NOx. Next slide, please. After the Intel expansion, this is what's left. And so in the today, if any of these facilities want to set up shop, we would be back to scratching our heads, having to reach out to San Francisco region, EPA Region 9, asking them to work with us. It's been a huge challenge. In fact, Chairman Gates with the county has sent a letter to EPA. Senator Sinema and Senator Kelly have sent letters to the EPA, desperately asking them to please work with us on passing 2 Maricopa County rules that would help with this. They've been sitting there for 18 months with no action. So again, this is why I bring this up. It's a very real challenge. We've had some pretty big hitters trying to push this, and it's crickets right now. And this is why we're so concerned. It's a very real issue. If we go serious and we see that threshold drop to 50 tons per year, or that major modification at 25 tons per year, this is a very, very real issue for us. So next slide, please.
Well, I guess another question around that is a lot of the support companies for like TSMC are locating in Pinal County. Do they have a similar problem, and are they going through this kind of procedure as well?
Chairman, it's a great question. Depends on where they locate. So I think that's why we're seeing growth outside the non-attainment area. I think kind of popping for that reason. These folks aren't, the folks that permit this are aware of this. And so when they look at those non-attainment boundaries, a portion of Pinal is in the non-attainment area. And so you can locate outside it. I think what the challenges is, and you heard me speak earlier, is that every 5 years, EPA gets to look at the standard again. Just in the last 2 weeks, EPA is looking at the ozone standard again. The trend is for them to lower it. They're not talking about lowering what they call the primary standard. Now they're talking about lowering a secondary standard, which is a much more complicated issue to deal with. As you can see, every time they seem to drop the standard, the non-attainment area boundary expands out with it, because again, we're a growing area, but then now monitors that would otherwise be in attainment are non-attainment. So it feels like we're constantly chasing this tiger's tail. So it depends on which part of Pinal. If you're talking the Casa Grande area, they're out of the non-attainment area right now. If you're talking about a little bit closer to the urban area, those portions are in.
Well, and you would think that with Intel and TSMC being a national security issue, that we should be able to get someone's attention.
Chairman, I would think that. And again, we were hoping to get more out of the senator's letters. Again, that was one of the things that when I talked to my colleague, Phil McNeely at the county, said, please bang that drum, Tim. It is still crickets in San Francisco, a rule that's been sitting up there for 18 months that would help us with this. There's been no action on it. So I would agree. I think this is such a significant issue. We would hear more about it, but we're certainly not.
Yeah, Rock?
I have a question about just following up on the attainment area. I noticed that the Gila River Indian community was not in the attainment area, yet your monitors were down to Casa Grande and Maricopa, and you did go into Pinal County to the east. I'm wondering why the GRIC is not included.
Chairman, members of the committee, it's a great question. Typically, when you do a non-attainment area boundaries, you try to go by jurisdiction. Because the tribes are sovereign nations, we typically try to stay out of the sovereign nations. Now, you'll see that a portion up closer where Fort McDowell and the Salt River are actually in because they're tucked so close to this region. But typically, under Clean Air Act guidance, what you try to do is exclude jurisdictional boundaries. So what you'll see is a non-attainment area down in Yuma, no-zone non-attainment area. You won't see it go into California, though. All of Imperial County is in non-attainment. It just makes it a lot easier from a planning perspective because, again, you're dealing with local jurisdictions versus either different sovereign or different state governments.
But it would seem to me with the open area, that would be positive to add the GRIC to the attainment area.
Chairman, members of the committee, again, it becomes a planning challenge. It's something the EPA just treats the tribes differently on this. So I wouldn't disagree that sometimes it helps to actually have more sources in, but just from a jurisdictional standpoint, they typically will exclude a state or a sovereign nation. In this case, we're talking about tribal nations. Next slide, please. Great. So we'll go into kind of where I think the two storms are really converging. I know that this is, when John Bowen had given his original presentation to regional council, this is actually what gave me kind of a sore stomach that day. When you start looking at new freeways, all these HOV miles, congestion mitigation projects, again, as you heard me say, is that we're going to need to look at new emission control measures in ways we simply haven't. Every molecule of ozone right now counts drastically. Each of these programs actually reduce ozone. And so again, is it a silver bullet? No, because there's no silver bullets really in ozone reductions. It takes a lot of different measures adding up over time to actually reduce that. These transportation measures, I can't stress enough. And again, I think you guys are more aware of the impacts of the Prop 400E issue. This is not only just a transportation issue, but it's actually now moving into the air quality world where we're going to be looking for new measures. We need all these other measures that were planned or in place actually operating and functioning properly. So again, this gave me pause for concern, as you can see with active transportation, the amount of money is the air quality, the arterial intersection. I don't have to read the slide to you, but again, from an air quality perspective, this is just beyond just transportation, moving people and freight safely. This is actually now things that are helping us reduce ozone concentrations that if we don't have these types of measures in place, we'll actually be increasing it. Next slide, please. Same goes with our public transit routes. Again, no one thing is a silver bullet, but every single measure counts. And if these are at risk, again, something got a little bit more sore is when we start looking at transit routes, folks have to move around. So does that mean they go to a single occupancy vehicle? Does that increase their vehicle miles traveled? Does these transportation projects that would otherwise loosen up the cities start causing congestion issues? Slow car and idling car is a more polluting car. Again, all these things are going in the wrong direction. And I think you folks know that the Prop 400 issue is definitely a big transportation issue. But that's why I really want to get in front of you guys today and say it's not just transportation, it's economics. It's actually an air quality issue. These storms are converging. I think it's, again, public transit routes that are at risk that, again, we do need to get this on the state's radar. It's not just a transportation issue. Next slide, please. Potential economic ramifications. So this is a study when I was over at ADEQ that we did. We scaled off a San Antonio study just to get an idea how big of an issue is this. And so what you can see here is a graph of our area. Again, it's not perfect, and I can tell you this is a very conservative estimate, is what does it cost in our area every single year that we're in non-attainment? It's substantial. As you can see, if we were to get into serious, it's substantial. These are definitely conservative estimates. We want to make sure we scale that properly just to make sure we're being conservative. But next slide, please. But if you're taking a look at Oklahoma City, they've just recently done this study. Same with Corpus Christi. They're talking in the same thing, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars each year, probably in the several hundreds of millions, the same in Oklahoma City. The thing there is obviously they're not the same type of economy as we are. We're a much bigger economy. So you would expect the same or bigger impacts. So again, air quality issue, transportation issue, but it's definitely an economic issue. So I want to kind of point that out. These are serious issues that we're already starting to see in South Texas and Oklahoma. They've done a study on this. Happy to share that with anybody. But again, it does hit the wallet. Next slide, please. So what about California? So most folks would say, well, California is so far down the tubes. How are they doing it? They're much worse classification. Well, the reality is we just don't have the size of the scale of economy as they do. They're a $3.4 trillion economy to our $411 million economy. The other thing I would point out here too, back to the offsets, California, Texas, a lot of our Rust Belt states are heavily industrialized. And so when one of those facilities shut down, you can actually use those credits as an offset. That happens a lot in California. It happens a lot in Texas. They have a lot more availability of offsets. We're not a heavily industrialized state. We don't have companies coming and going in those facilities shutting down. We can't grab them like we can here. So I want to point this out, as a lot of folks will say, well, California seems to be doing just fine. I think the answer is they're actually not. I think we saw at the last census, it's the first time California started to lose population. It is becoming a bigger issue. I'm sure you read about recently, California is now going to be banning fossil fuel vehicles after 2035. Most folks may not realize who did that. That was not an elected body. If you read in the newspapers, it was an unelected body. That was the California Air Resource Board. They're in the same issue. They're so far down the tubes to get credit, to get one of our state implementations to pass. They had to make that law so they could put on the books, model it, and send that to the EPA. Now, whether that actually comes to fruition or not, does it actually solve the problem or not? But on the books, California is actually having to put very strict rules that may or may not actually help their air quality. So I point that out. I think California's done a wonderful job branding themselves as a great environmental place. Their air quality is by far worse than ours. Their challenges are by far worse than ours. But the reality is they do have a much bigger economy than ours. And so to some extent, they can balance that. Next slide, please. So really why I'm here is just to bring this to your attention that both the air quality issue is upon us. That storm is hitting us. The Prop 400E issues, the transportation measures that go along with that, the public transit measures that go along with, if that does not get passed, will only exacerbate our issues with air quality. So again, for me, I'm seeing two very, very large storms converging. As you guys know, action is certainly needed on the Prop 400E issue, but as we start to have more conversations about emission reduction measures in the area, that's going to be a very big reality. So we need both of these things to pass just to ensure that our economy keeps doing what it's doing, which is growing, and that's something we wanted to do. With that, the next slide, please. With that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Chair. Yeah, before we go there, Tim, thank you. Very critical, timely information. I do want to mention to our committee that we will discuss Prop 400 extension in more detail when Nathan comes up later in the program. But if you have specific questions for Tim, please now.
Thank you. Tim, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned a couple cities, certainly California as a state, and then Oklahoma City, Corpus. How do we roughly compare? Again, I know EPA in some ways, I understand what they're doing, but is there any major urban area that is not in the same position that we are, or that, again, apart from, I understand the credits, which again, it's like paper water. It looks good, but you can't take a shower with it. So how are we comparing to other cities in similar situations? And apart from the credits, is there headway being made anywhere with this?
The chairman, members of the committee, I think it's a fantastic question. So as part of that new bump up to this moderate standard, 22 other urban areas across the nation were bumped up. So we're not alone in this issue. But I think when we start talking about who's heavily industrialized and who can generate a credit versus Arizona, I think that's where we start to see the challenge. So these are some of your traditional cities, Philly, Baltimore, again, old school, old industry, they shut down, you can take that headroom for a credit. So again, we're not alone in this. The difference is we're just not a heavily industrialized city. We just don't have that ability to generate those credits. And so we're trying to do what they call a non-traditional credit. So we're not shutting down companies, because I don't think that employees, and trying to do what they call a non-traditional, which is if you were to change out a fleet. So if you were to go from diesel to a cleaner diesel or to electric, can you take those emissions? So usually what they call a mobile emission credit reduction. Again, this is where we're seeing the EPA absolutely start to balk again on that. So I think that's a challenge. So for areas like us that are not heavily industrialized, those mobile credits are critical. And I know they cause challenges, and again, falls heavily on the transportation industry. We've had those discussions before. I think they're still valid to have those discussions. But again, when you're kind of scratching your head on where to go, you can do electrification of truck stops. Again, I know we've had that discussion. It becomes a challenging discussion, because you wish you were heavily industrialized, be able to take those credits. That's certainly the easier way. You can actually put on emission controls on older industry. Again, we just don't have those to do what's called a traditional offset. So that's why the mobile credit becomes so important. But again, that puts an onus on others. So again, that's why it's a challenge.
Let me re-ask my question in another way. So I understand the credits, but it's a bit of a manipulation, because those were ozone contributors. Correct me if I'm wrong, yesterday, but because they're no longer running, you get credit today, but it doesn't really impact the ozone production today. So is their ozone levels any better than we are, or are credits again just allowing them to say this is acceptable because of this machination?
Chairman, members of the committee, now I got your question. It's actually an excellent question. Those facilities are shut down today, and we're experiencing those good air qualities today. So it is somewhat of a paperwork exercise. If those companies are shut down 5 years ago, they do get to bank them. We're experiencing the positive impacts of that facility being shut down already. A new facility can just simply buy those off the table. The only time we see something actually happen today is like when Intel did theirs, they did actual real-time emission reductions. Otherwise, it can be a paperwork issue. Again, it's a similar issue we're seeing in Texas, California on the mobile side, but it's just not an issue they're seeing on the heavy industry side. So did that come close to the question?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I necessarily missed it, or, I mean, there's just a lot of information. We had, I think we're starting to insinuate, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, that Prop 400 is going to help us through that. If we get that Prop 400 extension, that's going to help us get through this. I'm skeptical that the legislature is going to see that argument with their view, I think, in total on climate change. So are we really going to make movement with the Prop 400? So talk a little bit about that if you can.
Chairman, members of the committee, I think it's another great question. You're exactly right on climate change. The state has a statute that says you cannot do that right now. The good thing on ozone, when I was over at ADQ, this is something that we had brought up to the governor multiple times. So this is simple, because it's not a climate change issue and it does have such ramifications to the economy. We were getting traction there. At one time, they did have something called a goal council, where they did have multiple directors working on single issues together. This was one of them. Ozone was on the radar. I think you're exactly right. This turns into a GHG or climate change thing that changes drastically, and then does require legislative approval to move in that area. And so again, I think the further we can keep these two issues apart, definitely. And I think it's important to also say, again, the Prop 400E or any of the single one measure that we talk about later on won't be a silver bullet. They do require to kind of stack on. And so I wish it could come to you and say, hey, here's the three top things. Stuff with Prop 400E is that. Each piece of the puzzle is absolutely needed. So again, is it a convincing 100% argument? No. I think the good thing is ozone is definitely on the governor's mind. It's certainly on Arizona Department of Environmental Quality's mind. So that helps a bit, but it certainly doesn't change the challenge.
I would think that ADEQ and the governor's office may be the best champions to talk about this issue rather than MAG. We have a vested interest in the Prop 400 extension piece, and we are the MPO for the region that is suffering from the greatest issue. However, us bringing the problem forward may not be the best. We may not be the best messenger. So I hope that the staff and the strategy is to utilize the true carriers of that rather than what may seem to be a self-serving discussion, even though at the end of the day, we all benefit from clean air. So thanks.
And Chairman and members of the committee, if I may comment to that, I 100% agree. I am talking with my colleague, Daniel Chetalinsky at the state. The state was real hot heavy on this several years ago. Unfortunately, shiny things. And so again, I'm having those conversations again. Phil McNeely at the county is having those conversations again, but I will continue to ring that bell because I would agree. The state is a big player in this. Doesn't touch GHG, so there's no reason why they can't be a huge player.
Okay, we have a question down here. Eric?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to follow up with Mayor Harkey's question too. I think it's important. There's kind of two aspects of this, kind of two balls to keep your eye on. One are the emissions buying and selling the credits, and that's really important for the economic development. And so the Intel expansion in Chandler was real key to that. And I remember working with Intel, trying to identify kind of where those credits going to come from. So there's that, and that has little to do with the monitoring of ozone levels in the region. And so that's a economic development important element of that. And without those credits, as Tim showed on the graph, there's no flexibility to welcome new companies into the valley without those credits in place. So there's that. Then there's the whole, how do we lower the ozone levels in the region? And that involves a lot of the mitigation measures that we're already committed to as we were a marginal area. And as we move up now in a moderate level, we have to implement more of those. And so mitigation measures don't come cost-free. And so to the extent in public transportation, as an example, is a major contributor to taking cars off the street, quite frankly. And so that helps lower the emissions. So if we do away, as the transit map shows, if we can't fund public transportation outside of the city of Phoenix because we don't have those regional funds, that means we won't be able to follow through on these committed measures that have fairly significant implications if we don't pursue those measures. And so including loss of federal transportation funds. So once again, so those are the two elements. We have to, economic development. And I also agree with Mr. Stipp's comment about MAG should not be the messenger of this. We can provide data, but it's really the economic development professionals who are very concerned with this. We've had conversations with GPEC and ACA. GPEC in particular is very concerned about kind of how do we move forward if we can't demonstrate that we're making progress in the ozone front. So just wanted to provide those two comments.
Mayor Osborne.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chair. I do have a question. On one of the slides you showed, there was kind of the history, not the history of ozone, but it was the historically what ozone has done. And there was a significant drop back in the 2008 through maybe 11 timeframe. What was that attributed to?
Chairman, members of the committee, yeah, exactly. It was recession. The
Okay.
recession hit us that hard that we saw it in so many different industries. It actually dropped ozone that significant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Tim? Well, thank you again. Really timely, important information for us right now. So thank you. Okay, next, item 7 on the agenda will be presented by Brad Williams, MAG Transportation Engineer, an overview of State Route 30 facility. Brad? And this agenda item is for information and discussion only. Thank you. Go ahead, Brad.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This presentation will give you a quick overview of the State Route 30 corridor, also known as the Tres Rios Freeway. Next slide, please. We'll begin with a description of the corridor. Next slide, please. State Route 30 will be located about 4 miles south of I-10 and will ultimately run from State Route 85 in Buckeye to the I-17 near downtown Phoenix. That's a distance of roughly 30 miles. It's divided into 3 segments. Each segment is connecting to an existing freeway at both ends. So the west segment runs from State Route 85 to Loop 303, the Estrella Freeway. The center section goes from Loop 303 to Loop 202, the South Mountain Freeway, and the eastern section will run from Loop 202 to I-17. Next slide, please. State Route 30 first appeared in 2003 in the Regional Transportation Plan adopted by the MAG Regional Council. At that time, the corridor included only the west and center segments. Shortly thereafter, Maricopa voters approved Proposition 400, and in 2006, the corridor was included in the Freeway Life Cycle Program for design and implementation. But the recession of 2008 caused a reduction in revenues, and the corridor was deferred beyond the Prop 400 funding horizon in a program rebalance. Then, starting around 2017, MAG began adding funding for right-of-way acquisition and advanced utility works on the center section, and those works are continuing today. Our latest transportation plan, Momentum 2050, has added the east segment and defined an upgraded facility in the west section. The Prop 400 Extension Investment Plan now includes funding for the entire corridor. Next slide, please. Now we'll take a look at the corridor segment by segment, beginning with the center segment. Next slide, please. The center section will be the first to be implemented because it provides the largest immediate benefit to the region. This 15-mile section will carry the most traffic, reducing the most traffic on I-10 and also the greatest amount of reduction in region-wide congestion. Next slide, please. Planning for the center section began in 2005 with a project scoping and environmental study, but the study took much longer to complete than had been anticipated. Stormwater drainage and other issues required lengthy coordination with multiple utility agencies, and the program rebalance also contributed to the delay. By 2017, the complex utility needs were defined, and MAG began to add funding for right-of-way and advanced utility works in the life cycle program, the Freeway Life Cycle Program. This made it possible for the project scoping and environmental study to be completed in 2020. Last year, the Momentum 2050 Regional Transportation Plan and the Prop 400 Extension Investment Plan were approved by the MAG Regional Council. And this included funding for construction of the center segment in the first phase of the plan. Next slide, please. Here's a diagram from the project scoping and environmental study showing the initial construction effort for the center segment. The initial construction will have 3 lanes in each direction with a wide median. There will be system interchanges with grade separated ramps connecting the freeways at Loop 303 and Loop 202. 13 other traffic interchanges are anticipated. The ultimate configuration will add an additional 4th lane and 1 high occupancy vehicle in each direction. Next slide, please. These images show how the widening will occur. The left image shows the initial construction effort with a wide median. The right image shows the new lanes are being added in the median. This will ensure that the design along the outer edges of the freeway can remain unchanged even when the project is upgraded. Next slide, please. Now let's move to the east segment. This 5-mile section will be the second segment to be implemented following the center segment. A study of sequential phasing of the corridor in 2021 concluded that the east segment would have higher traffic benefits as the second segment to be implemented. Next slide, please. The region began planning for the east segment in 2013 when MAG conducted the State Route 30 alignment feasibility study. This study demonstrated the benefits of the segment in improving access to downtown Phoenix. 2017 was a busy year with the I-10, I-17 corridor master plan known as the Spine Study, recommending a system interchange concept for the junction of I-17 with State Route 30. And the regional transportation plan added the east segment at that time. 2021 was another busy year. The scoping study for this segment was accepted by the MAG Regional Council, and the Prop 400 Extension Investment Plan incorporated funding to implement the east segment of State Route 30 with construction in Phase 4. Next slide, please. The 2021 scoping study did not recommend a specific alignment or number of lanes for the east segment, but it did envision system interchanges with grade separated ramps both at Loop 202 and I-17, and 3 traffic interchanges in between. The alignment, number of lanes, and other design parameters will be developed during project design. Next slide, please. Now we'll look at the west segment. Next slide, please. When State Route 30 was first introduced in the 2003 Regional Transportation Plan, and when it was programmed in 2006 in the Freeway Life Cycle Program, it was defined as an arterial road with sufficient right-of-way to be acquired for an upgrade to a freeway at a later date. After the project was deferred beyond the Prop 400 funding horizon in 2009, it would be a dozen years before the west segment was again included in the Prop 400 Extension Investment Plan in Phase 5. The operational concept has changed to include a portion of freeway and a portion of arterial road in the west segment. This was because the region wanted to avoid a throwaway infrastructure. Considering the growth that has occurred and is expecting in the coming years, the eastern half of this segment would likely need to be upgraded to a freeway quickly after its construction if it weren't upgraded as part of the initial construction effort. Next slide, please. The 10-mile long west segment is now planned as a freeway with 2 lanes in each direction between Loop 303 and MC 85. That's the eastern half of this segment. From MC 85 to State Route 85, it will be an arterial street with only 1 lane in each direction. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the transportation impacts of this corridor. The recommendations that are made at MAG are primarily data-driven. So I just want to share a few items that demonstrate the transportation benefits of State Route 30. Next slide, please. The Tres Rios Freeway will provide significant benefits to everyone using the I-10 freeway in this area. Peak period travel times on I-10 will be shorter by 11 to 16 minutes when the full corridor is open to traffic. That correlates to a daily savings of 49,000 vehicle hours per day. These numbers represent the full corridor being built. About half of these benefits will be achieved with the center section construction. The other half will come as the east and west segments are added. Next slide, please. There are also benefits within the area served by State Route 30. Here we can see volumes on the freeway for the center section ranging between 116,000 and 183,000 vehicles a day. Those are healthy freeway traffic volumes, and they will certainly help to reduce congestion on all of the parallel roads within the area. Next slide, please. So how much will State Route 30 cost? Next slide, please. The center segment will cost $2.1 billion. 5 major projects have been identified to conduct the design and construction, but some of these major projects will probably be broken into even smaller sections, smaller pieces for the design and construction. I want to note at the bottom left-hand corner here, you see an asterisk that says these numbers do not include $562 million that has been used to fund right-of-way acquisition and advanced utility works for the center segment. So the actual cost of the center segment, when that's included, is closer to $2.7 billion. The east segment will cost another $2.1 billion, and the west segment will add $878 million. So adding these all up together, the cost of State Route 30 in the investment plan, the Prop 400 extension investment plan is almost $5.1 billion. Next slide, please. Mr. Chair, this concludes the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Questions or comments from Brad? Mayor Waters?
Something we've done 3 or 4 years ago was approve water for APS for this project. Did that get done? I never did hear that was completed. It's not completed. There are plans to, I'm not sure if it's fully funded, but there are funds. I know there's been a change in the design and will be, I think, going into construction soon.
It is fully funded too. And and they've been working on the different segments over the past few years. It's one of the long lead time items. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that we had funding in for the utility relocation.
Chair.
Mayor
And-
Harkey?
And maybe Eric, this is a question for you, is I feel if anyone are the champions of this or people in this room, I'm just curious, is there intent for us? I thought we already have seen most of these slides before. I'm just curious, why is this on our agenda? I feel we understand this program. There's certainly more, but so just out of curiosity.
Mr. Chairman, Mayor Harkey, members of the TPC, we thought it'd be useful just to update the current status and for questions like the utility question that Mayor Wires just asked. So it's been probably a year since we brought this forward. So we thought it'd be useful to have this presentation.
Okay, thank you.
So, and perhaps this is a question for Eric, but how much will delaying getting Prop 400 extension done impact the schedule for this project?
We're looking at some of those cost implications of delay right now, but back in the envelope calculation, just for the center section, including the extension of the 303 to connect to the State Route 30, we think that a 2-year delay would probably add close to $300 million to the project. So it's moving from $2.5 billion for the center section and the 303 extension up to 2.8, maybe even higher. So once again, inflation is pretty significant right now, really impacting project costs.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Item number 8, Federal Transportation Discretionary Grants, September 2022 update. Presented by Patrick Stone, Transportation Improvement Program Supervisor. This item is on the agenda for information and discussion. Patrick?
Got it. Thank you, Nathan. First is federal transportation funding. I'll do that at a very high level overview. A brief discussion of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then a more detailed dive into discretionary grant opportunities. Next slide, please. So federal transportation funding in the region really follows one of 2 paths. The first, those formula funds that can either come directly to the MAG region or they're allocated from ADOT as a pass-through. And then second, in the focus of the conversation today, is federal discretionary funding. Next slide, please. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, you've heard about this many times in the past, largest investment in infrastructure in the nation's history, signed into law last November. The emphasis really here for the grants, it not only added additional funding to existing grants that the members are familiar with, like the RAISE grant, it also introduced many new grant funding opportunities. Next slide. So before I get into specific grant opportunities, I kind of wanted to set the table and make a distinction between regional funding and then local funding. So regional funding are those, and Quinn's presentation earlier on the 35th Avenue grant. That's one of those large regional type projects, capital intensive type project, usually found in the freeway and transit lifecycle programs. Sorry about that. The slide moved on me. And one thing I did want to emphasize on this one, and you saw it at the end of her presentation, it's the level of coordination and cooperation you need on those types of grants. You saw for that rail crossing elimination grant, 4 different agencies are heavily involved in the preparation and application for that grant. One advantage of these regional grants, and I think Quinn alluded to that as well, those dollars that are received in the region have the ability to make other dollars available to either accelerate projects or bring new projects in. Next slide, please. When we talk about local grant opportunities, these are much more smaller, discrete type grants. A couple of the ones that I'll discuss later are those types of grants. They usually have a very specific area of emphasis. Just last week, we had a grant closure for the Safe Streets for All grant. So very focused on safety. Next slide, please. So the regional approach to grants, it's really a threefold approach. The first is getting the information from USDOT about the grants themselves, especially with all of the new grants. While they are mentioned in law, it is really in the notice of funding opportunity, or the NOFO, that you get the information that tells you what USDOT is looking at when member agencies are looking to apply for those grants. What we then do, and you see this with the rail crossing elimination grant, is we take our existing tools and data and we screen those regional projects, and we try and find those that would be the most competitive for the grants based on the criteria and the scoring. And what we are also looking at is potentially using these tools to assist with those smaller local grant opportunities. And then finally, and this makes sense, it's sort of a circular approach. Once we do these grants, once we see what USDOT looked at, what they score, what they favored, we'll be able to provide that information back to member agencies and say, hey, next year when we look to do this type of grant, these were the types of grants that were successful last year. Do you have those types of projects? Next slide, please. Quickly, I've got 5 current grant opportunities. I was going to discuss one upcoming grant opportunity, but just to speak to how dynamic this is, there's actually now 7 grant opportunities. There were 2 that were released this week, in fact. The NOFOs came out on Monday. We were notified yesterday. Those will actually be included as part of the regional council agenda for next week. But I did want to note that these do change quite rapidly. The first grant of the current grant opportunities, and this is one Quinn spoke about earlier, railroad crossing elimination. This is to eliminate both highway rail and pathway rail conflicts. $573 million is being made available nationally, and the applications are due early in October. The next one, the mobility, access, and transportation insecurity. This is a very unusual grant. It's actually a single grant. There will be one grant awarded for $6 million nationally to look at addressing issues of transportation and security. Those applications are due October 11. Next slide. Reconnecting the communities. This is one of the new grant funding programs that we've discussed, a more targeted type of grant looking to eliminate barriers that have separated communities. $195 million will be available with grants being due, applications being due mid-October. For member agencies are Native Nations. We have the Nationally Significant Federal Lands and Tribal Projects Program. This is a very unusual program. We actually, the region got one of these grants last year. The Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community was successful in an application. But what this does is it looks at the construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and it's really those access points and adjacency to federal and tribal lands. Applications for this grant program are due in late October on the 24th. Next slide, please. Finally, the current grant opportunity, the last one, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement, or CRISI grant. This is one that actually is done every year. A big grant too, almost $1.5 billion are made available, really to improve railroad safety, efficiency, and reliability. Those applications will be due in December. And then finally, and this is another annual grant, the Tribal Transportation Program Safety Fund. We expect a NOFO for this grant to come out in October, with applications being due in early calendar year 2023. Next slide, please. Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. Very quick, brief presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Patrick? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, next on the agenda, Nathan Pryor will give us our Government Relations Director will give us a legislative update.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In a moment, too, I will also introduce John Bolin to help provide some of this update information. But as it relates to Prop 400 extension, of course, we continue to focus on that multi-path effort, if you will, to get that ballot back to the voters. So part of that effort has been outreach. So outreach includes business community, associations, chambers, individual businesses. That conversation has been ongoing and hopefully we believe really gaining positive traction, really sharing that information about the consequences and impacts of the veto, the same presentation that's been delivered to this body. So that's been going well. But as was mentioned earlier in the conversation with this body today, it's not just the mobility piece, it's the economic piece. John Bolin will talk about that here in a moment. And also, of course, the air quality piece that we heard today. So we continue to refine our talking points when we present this information. As was stated earlier, it's really incumbent upon business community to help deliver that message to governor's office and legislators. So we appreciate those conversations to date. Similarly, I know Supervisor Sellers, you had an opportunity to share this information at the Rural Transportation Summit. So we do appreciate that. More recently, we had a special MAG Economic Development Committee meeting. More recently, sharing again the impacts to the veto from the veto going forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over to John Bolin with your permission. He's going to give a little look ahead in terms of the economic impact analysis. That information we anticipate will be delivered at the policy committees in the October timeframe.
Okay, thank you. And before you start, John, I will just mention quickly that Mayor Weiss and I, along with MAG staff, have been meeting very actively to determine what the best approach is for us to get this done as quickly as possible, because we know how critical timing is on this project. Mayor Hartke and I did speak to the Chandler Chamber of Commerce and East Valley Partnership a little over a week ago. And I spoke to the Rural Transportation Summit. I was very encouraged. You know, a lot of rural legislators attend that conference, and they were all very supportive. And my message to them was, this isn't just a Maricopa County issue. It really is a statewide issue because of the connectivity through Maricopa County. But also, if we don't get this approved, now we are competing for the same funds they are. And we don't really want to get into that situation. We need statewide transportation plans, and that's what this is really trying to help us support. So, John?
Just if I could, Mr. Chairman, that's a good reminder as well, in case I forget it here later. We all depend on you all to inform us in terms of business associations, chambers, others, to which we should be presenting. So if you have those recommendations, please, by all means, grab a MAG staff member, let us know, email us, call us. We will be anywhere we need to be offering up this message. So.
Okay. And I think all of you know by now, this is absolutely my number one priority. And we are reaching out to as many of the truly key players we can to say, you know, what do we need to do to get this done? And obviously, for this committee, I need to mention that we know that we really can't afford to do any significant changes to the proposition, because then we'd have to go back through a whole approval process. We don't have time to do that. But, you know, if there's some wordsmithing we can do that makes this more palatable to some of the people that have objected, that's what we're trying to determine. And we certainly are going to find the quickest possible path for us to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the TPC. So I'll just touch real briefly what data that Nathan had indicated. So back in early August, August 3rd to be exact, Regional Council Executive Committee approved funding to initiate a economic analysis on the extension program. The intent there is just to give further support to demonstrate about why we need to get this to the ballot as quick as possible. So since that point, There's been a team of people working on this around the clock. I am pleased to report that that work has concluded. The analysis is done. We will be rolling that out, as Nathan had mentioned, in the October committee cycle. We all know anecdotally the role that the dedicated sales tax plays in the economy. Pleased to report that the numbers more than emphasize that. And so it will provide an additional tool for you all as you engage in these conversations. But bottom line, this is about our region's competitiveness. This is about lowering the cost of doing business here. This is about creating jobs, and it creates thousands of jobs, creates thousands of high-paying jobs, and really diversifies our economy. So we're very pleased to be able to share that information with you come October.
Thank you. And I will just mention one other thing, and that is that, GPEC is really helping us a lot with this data. But, one of the messages that, we know what the economic benefit of doing this is just based on the economic success we've had from Prop 300 and 400. So we also are going to be able to point out what happens if we don't approve this and the negative impacts for our whole region if this happens. And I think when we do that, people will understand how critical this is. Any questions, comments for Nathan?
Mr. Chair, just one thing to add too. So we had a briefing with Chris Camacho and the GPEC team on Monday to review because they're a partner in our economic analysis. So one of the things that Chris mentioned to us, and we're going to follow this up, is I think it's really important to put together an analysis of what some of our competitive regions are doing in transportation and compare that to what happens if we don't have the extension in place. So we're going to continue to compile information that we think is relevant and to make that economic development argument for the region.
Other comments, questions? Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item 10. Are there any requests by a Transportation Policy Committee member for a future agenda item? Any comments from committee members? I think we wore you all out. Okay, seeing none, the meeting is adjourned.